What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? Was working the evening shift at a gas station. Man comes in all disoriented. I go to help him out. He has a gash on his head and doesn't know where he was. I couldn't see any crashes around, so assumed he had fallen or something. Normally we are supposed to stay inside the glass-shielded register area whenever anyone is in the store. I, being a nice human being, went to help while calling the police/EMS. They got there and checked him out. They thought his head may have been fractured. Took him to the ER. I went back to work. Cops stopped back by for some coffee a few hours later. They told me the guy got hit by a baseball bat trying to break into a little girl's bedroom and was wanted for rape and murder in 2 other states. I never left the register area at night again. The Lake Newest disaster. The lake periodically belches a cloud of invisible carbon dioxide gas that suffocates everything within a 16-mile radius. In 1986, over 1,700 people and all their livestock died without even understanding what was happening to them. The story of Mary Vincent always stands out to me. In 1978, 15-year-old Mary was hitchhiking. A man named Lawrence Singleton picked her up. He brutally raped her, and eventually made her get out of the car. She planned to run, but he noticed, and cut both her arms off. He threw her into a ditch/ravine and left her to die. She packed her stumps with mud to stop the bleeding and spent all night crawling out. She eventually makes it to the highway and starts walking, naked and covered in blood. The first car that saw her sped away in fear. The second car was a couple on their honeymoon. They picked her up and she survived. Edited to add, I was in a rush when I wrote this, so you should definitely read more into the story. It's crazy. From the horrific act itself, to the court proceedings, to the fact that he hardly served any time. John List killed his whole family: wife, mother, daughter and 2 sons. He meticulously planned the whole thing, canceling all delivery services, excusing the kids from school, and even turned the air conditioning as low as possible to preserve the bodies for as long as possible. After he killed them all, he placed the bodies in sleeping bags and lined them up. He then wrote a letter to his pastor explaining why he had to kill them. He then leaves and isn't heard from again. 18 years later he's remarried and doing the same job as before, but this time he doesn't have any children. He's finally arrested after a tip was given to the FBI. Crazy thing is that because he planned it so well, the bodies weren't discovered until a month after the murder, so he had a huge head start and essentially started a new life in the same career and was heavily involved in a new church down in Virginia. Took 18 years to capture him. In my town in the early 90s there was a notorious killer that had all of British Columbia, Canada on watch. My wife's mother, years and years before I knew them, had been home alone while her husband was in England doing tree surgeon work, arborist. She was in her laundry room when a man walked up from her basement, completely scaring her. She freaked out and said, "What the hell are you doing here?" He said he was friends with her husband and was just coming to see if he was here. Apparently he told him he could just walk in. Which she knew was bullshit. She was smart enough to tell him that he was just at the store and would be back any minute. He said he would wait outside for him. As soon as he left she called the police, but he was long gone by the time they got here. 2 weeks later, the killer was caught. His mugshot put on TV and it was the guy in her house. An acquaintance of mine sent his son to triathlon camp in Texas. A week later, his son came back from camp. The next day, the son was complaining of a headache. 4 days later, he was dead. Healthy, happy, fit 12-year-old 1 week, dead the next. Turns out the lake had Naegleria fowleri, the brain-eating amoeba. Nothing scares me as irrationally as already being dead and waiting for your body to catch on. 3 sailors survived the sinking of the USS West Virginia at Pearl Harbor, only to die 16 days later, due to the lack of air. The Navy knew they were there, but couldn't get to them. 16 days to die. My dad and some friends got drunk and went for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go as teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others and eventually demanded they let him get out. They pulled over and he and one other girl got out. He and the girl started walking to town while the other 3 sped off in the opposite direction. Well, less than a mile up the road from where they got out is an extremely sharp turn, which they missed and hit a tree going pretty close to triple digits, miles per hour. Two of them died on impact, and the only reason the third survived is because they crashed in front of a house that two doctors lived in. The survivor was paralyzed and lost his leg and part of his arm and was in the hospital for 8 months before dying. This was in the 60s, so medical care wasn't what it is today. When I first got my permit, my dad took me to that corner to explain the importance of safe driving. It gave me goosebumps about how close he was to being in the truck. He said that the dad of the driver got what remained of the truck to be hung up in the center of town for months after, to be a warning to all. This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up, maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby murdered 6 children and 1 adult by intentionally driving the wrong way on a divided highway in an attempt to commit suicide. She had been hospitalized for depression, but had also just ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother and was by some reports involved in drug trafficking and fearing an imminent arrest. She picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. She then loaded her 3 children into the car, supposedly to pick up a gift for the nephew. Instead, she went missing with the carload of kids. A short time later, calls started coming into 911 about a car going the wrong way down the highway at a high rate of speed. They made it about 90 seconds before a head-on collision with another vehicle, driven by a father with 2 children and another child along for the ride. The crash annihilated both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself, and the child who was along for the ride in the other car. There were pieces of children all over the highway. She was sentenced to 215 years in prison. Years ago when I was 8, my family lived in this big weird house kind of on the edge of a small town. The school district was in the middle of a big restructuring, so even though we were only a couple grades apart, my brother and I went to different schools and took different buses. This left me as the last person to leave in the morning and the first person to get home in the afternoon, which meant it was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the door was locked. One morning I noticed the basement door was open and the light was on, so before I left I turned off the light and closed the door. When I got home that afternoon, the light was on and the door was open again. I just assumed that I'd forgotten to actually take care of it when I noticed it in the morning, so I went over to turn off the light and close the door. When I got to the top of the basement stairs, I looked and there was a big shadowy male figure towards the bottom of the staircase. I freaked out, slammed the door and pushed a bunch of boxes against it, and then went and hid in my closet. For months I didn't tell my family because I was positive what I had seen was a ghost and didn't think anyone would believe me. Then about a year after that incident, my mom and her boyfriend realized that small amounts of money had been going missing for months, totaling around $800 to $900, but never more than $60 at once. So we all walked around the house with flashlights trying to figure out how they could have gotten in. Turns out some creep was climbing in through a small hole in the outside of the house, shimmying through a crawl space, then coming up into the house through the basement. Realizing I had been alone in the house with him on at least one occasion was one of the worst, most terrifying moments I've ever had. My brother's ex-GF had 2 older sisters. They died before she was born. One day they decided to play hide and seek or something, so anyway, they both climbed inside a chest and accidentally locked themselves in. They suffocated. Tough to pick just one because there is true evil and humanity out there. Stuff like the Blood Eagle ritual is pretty awful, but in terms of really scary, probably stuff that just kind of happens on accident. Like the story of Kyle Plush. Just awful. He was in a minivan that has one of those back seats that you can push backward to lay flat in the trunk for extra storage space. He went to grab something in the trunk, leaning over the seat, and it tipped backward and pinned him, upside down, against the back of the car in a position such that he couldn't get himself out. He called the police twice. The second time he called and gave them a very clear description of the car. Plush called 911 again at around 3:35 p.m. Police said this time he provided a description of the vehicle as he desperately pleaded for help but couldn't hear the dispatcher. Isaac said the information didn't get relayed to officers at the scene. "This is not a joke," the teen said over 911. "I'm almost dead." He asked the dispatcher to tell my mom I love her if I die. Just a horrible, random accident that could have happened to anybody. This kid didn't go looking for trouble, like he didn't try and go down a chimney or go caving like other people who have gotten stuck and suffocated. He was just reaching for something in his trunk, got pinned, and then was not found in time. Nightmarish for the kid and his family. Nutty Putty Cave in Utah was sealed up in 2009 after John Jones was trapped upside down in a small crevice while spelunking. When rescue teams finally arrived, he had been upside down for so long that his legs were drained of blood. The only possible way to have gotten him out was to break his legs, which would have sent him into fatal shock. He died after being trapped for 28 hours. His body's still in the cave. I'll tell you one that happened to me, or rather, I was witness to. One night, I was out at a bar with a friend I was visiting in New Rochelle, New York. We went outside for a cigarette, and a car came flying past the bar. The car burned through a red light, and started going up this hill that was on a curve. We watched as he veered over the double yellow, and smashed head-on with another car coming from the other direction. Both cars' hind ends lifted up, then slammed down. The car that was driving correctly burst into flames. I ran inside and grabbed the fire extinguisher, then yelled to the bartender to call 911 and say there has been an accident. My friend, a few other patrons, and me ran to the cars. Now, I used to think this was a fictional trope, but I was pretty drunk before this happened, and I swear it sobered me up instantly. I tried spraying the fire, but it did nothing. The fumes and heat were awful, and all we could do was stand back. The worst part was, and this will haunt me forever, was that the woman in the burning car was screaming as she died. My God, it was the worst sound ever. The fire department came and put the fire out. The police took us back to the bar and took statements. I found out the next day in the news that the car that was not speeding was being driven by a young woman coming home late from work. She was a block away from home, and I think she was either newly married or a new mother. The rotten driving the other car was some rich drunk cocksucker. He lost a leg, but otherwise was physically unharmed. I have no clue if he did time, as I left to go back home a day or so later. Years ago, my now husband worked for an industrial laundry company in their head office when a PR disaster happened that also mentally screwed up a number of people. Their company collected laundry from large hospitals and medical-type businesses, e.g. care homes, etc., and cleaned them. You can imagine the sort of heavy-duty cleaning, bleaching, boiling, etc. needed to remove those sort of biological contaminants. One day a laundry cart went through the usual bleaching, boiling cycle before it dropped out into a conveyor belt to be sorted for drying/pressing when there was a horrid scream. A small newborn baby's body had been discovered tangled up amongst the sheets. It had been cooked. The laundry workers were distraught. The whole place had to be shut down. Police called and the laundry tracked back to the hospital to discover what happened. It turns out thankfully in some ways, stillborn baby had been left in the cot waiting to be taken down to the hospital mortuary after the parents had said their goodbyes and covered it with a blanket, but somehow one of the nurses hadn't realized, just on shift was the best guess, so just grabbed up all the linen out the cot and off the bed in the delivery room with the body bundled inside and emptied it into the laundry hamper/trolley thing. The other nurses/parents assumed the baby had been collected by the mortuary to be stored awaiting their funeral decisions. The laundry was found not to be to blame, but the parents were devastated and the hospital took a lot of flack. The poor laundry workers who discovered the body ended up being given counseling before eventually quitting. The laundry did amend its practice to individually emptying each laundry hamper into the industrial machines instead of just tipping them in to stop anything like that happening again. The Toy Box Killer and his transcripts. If you absolutely want to have your day ruined, this has to be one of the most disturbing, creepiest things ever. Serial killer David Parker Ray would play these tapes for his victims, so they had an idea of what was coming and to also mentally break them. Hear the start of one tape to give you an idea. Hello there. Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it. Wrists and ankles chained. Gagged. Probably blindfolded. You are disoriented and scared, too, I would imagine. Perfectly normal, under the circumstances. For a little while, at least, you need to get your SHT together and listen to this tape. It is very relevant to your situation. I'm going to tell you, in detail, why you have been kidnapped, what's going to happen to you and how long you'll be here. I don't know the details of your capture, because this tape is being created July 23, 1993 as a general advisory tape for future female captives. Can you imagine how terrifying it would be to wake up in a place you didn't know and have someone play these tapes for you telling you what horrible things were going to happen to you before you died? I remember this poor kid who went missing while I was at Purdue. He was trying to come home to his dorm after a party and either wasn't able to get into the building or perhaps wanted to bypass the check-in desk, just a guess based on my experience as a student there, since he had been drinking. He entered the building through a door to an electrical closet that should have been locked and was electrocuted and killed that night. He was last seen January 13th and the body was discovered March 19th after reports of foul odors at the dorm. Edit: the body was found at Owen Hall, year 2007. I remember talking with friends about theories of what happened when he went missing. How terrifying it must have been to find out there was a dead body in your dorm for months. Update: thanks for the silver. And thanks everyone for contributing the memories and other details/lingering questions. Sorry if any current Purdue folks are feeling weirded out. Be safe and stay out of the maintenance closets. My wife arrived at her parents' house that she was currently living in due to health issues of her father's. She got into the house, no one else was there at the time, and instead of going further in, stopped in the first room that held the computers, which was right by the door. She went into the room and was messing around on the internet when one of the cats came into the room. Her cat, to be precise. Well, this cat was super laid back. Loved everyone and never picked fights or got aggressive. He would literally lay down and let squirrels throw pecans at him from trees and do nothing but take it. Not tonight, however. Tonight he was growling and hissing intermittently while standing between my wife and the entrance to the rest of the house. A laid-back sweet old cat was acting like he was going to rip out a throat. Well, my wife decided that this was really weird, so she picked up her cat and left the house. Lo and behold, she sees a cop car patrolling down her street and flagged them down. She explained the situation and they demanded, that she stay in their cruiser while they both checked it out. Turns out they found the back door wide open. Super bad. Her parents and her never leave the door unlocked, much less open. She came to find out later from those cops that they were hunting down a serial rapist that had been spotted in the area, and that was why they were rolling down a safe, normally, residential street. Super spooky. Life pro tip? Always trust the cat. Happened to me, have posted about it before. I was around 11 years old and I woke up in the middle of the night to a man straddled on top of me with his hand over my mouth and nose. He told me to roll over and not scream. I rolled onto the floor and tried to scream bloody murder. I say tried cause when you are truly terrified it can take a second to find your voice. My mom heard me screaming and came in and fought with the guy. He was at least 6, she was 5 feet 3 inches, and scared him enough with the fighting and screaming that he took off out the window he had come in through. Never did catch him. Have you heard of the Nazis so bad that other Nazis, in particular fellow SS Nazis, constantly tried to get him and his unit disbanded and arrested? No? Well, his name was Oskar Dirlewanger, and his unit was nicknamed the Black Hunters or the Dirlewanger Brigade. Oskar Dirlewanger was an early adopter of the Nazi Party. He had been thrown in jail before for being a pedophile. Eventually, when World War II broke out and healthy ideal Germans were dying in droves on the Eastern Front, Oskar's old pal Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, granted him a command of a unit made up originally of German poachers, and eventually German criminals being held in civilian jails, camps, and military criminals. His unit was essentially designated as a rearguard unit meant to hunt down enemy partisans, or in most cases civilians in occupied countries. Oskar Dirlewanger SS unit was responsible for many atrocities. Some atrocities so barbaric and bad other SS units reported him and his unit for atrocities. A few examples, which have been popularized in film, include taking an entire village in Belarus and putting them in a church, locking the doors, and setting the church ablaze. Anyone who tried to escape was shot by machine guns and rifles. This unit raped, tortured, and murdered its way through Eastern and Central Europe. During the Warsaw Uprising they were sent to help squelch the uprising. One of their atrocities committed was going into a children's hospital, telling the nurses and staff that they were there to secure the church. Okay. Once the church was secured they raped the female staff, and some of the wounded and sick female children victims, and then went around shooting everyone. If anyone was found to have survived they were bayoneted. These guys were so horrible that other Nazis looked down their noses at them, and constantly filed complaints and reports against them, but with no real success. Thankfully by the end of the war this unit was destroyed and its leaders and criminal soldiers were hunted down like rabid animals. A high-priority inmate who could implicate dozens of wealthy and powerful people apparently committed suicide while on suicide watch at his prison. And the footage can't be found due to a malfunction of the camera. But, the news told me that's how it happened and the news is never wrong. Told this here before but once more. My friend had this neighbor who was a retired mechanic. They lived on some properties with large front lawns and long driveways. His neighbor had a couple derelict cars parked up near his garage that he took parts from occasionally. This neighbor of his started hearing noises while sitting in his living room, coming from his front yard. Every time he'd go to the window, there would be nothing there. He assumed it was a raccoon or a coyote or whatever. He kept hearing the noise, so he'd go outside to look around but would find nothing. He'd put out traps and occasionally catch something, yet the noise persisted. Soon, he started claiming that he was hearing voices coming from the front yard, like whispering. He'd go outside and look around the perimeter of his property but would find nothing. It was persistent, so he'd started calling the cops. Every time the cops came and looked around and would find nothing, so they told him he needed to stop calling them for this, and perhaps get a security camera or whatever. So this guy thought he was losing his mind. One summer evening he couldn't sleep, so he went to the back patio to smoke a cigarette. Suddenly, he heard voices coming from the front of his house. He put his cig out and snuck around to the front and got there just in time to see the doors to his derelict conversion van silently shut. He ran back to the backyard and went inside his home and called the police to tell them what he had seen. The police arrived and approached cold, i.e. without lights/sirens, and when they approached the van, the doors swung open and a bunch of people ran out in every direction. Upon searching the van, the cops found syringes and paraphernalia and determined that people were shooting up in there. A guy I worked with was riding his dirt bike through the woods and somebody hung a cable between two trees. My buddy caught his throat on it and saw the dude steal his dirt bike. Woke up in the hospital with a lacerated throat and a broken larynx. Pretty crazy what somebody will do for something so cheap. During World War II, an American airplane crashed near the Japanese island of Shikijima. There were 9 servicemen on board. 1 was rescued by an American submarine. The other 8 were taken in by the Japanese. Don't want to go into all the details, but through some time and events, the Japanese ended up eating those servicemen. But that's not the weird part. The one serviceman who was rescued? That was George H.W. Bush. Google Shikijima incident for more details if you'd like. A headless, limbless torso was found in the bushes at the rest stop in the town where I grew up. They never found the rest of her body parts or the murderer. She wasn't even identified until about a decade later. She was a prostitute that had been estranged from her family. My mom's theory is that a truck driver from out of state did it. Dismembered her, dumped her torso at the rest stop, and scattered the rest of her over state lines. Could have been an isolated incident, or it could be a serial killer. We might not ever know. Edit. Here's a news article on it if any of you are interested. Right City torso. I was in a crappy motel. The room had bed bugs. I was too exhausted to go to the front desk. I just needed to make it until the morning. I slept in the tub. Hours later I hear someone breaking through the window. I had a big knife with me and ran out into the room to find a man halfway through my window. We stared for a while at each other in shock. I think we both were scared. Then he says, "Is this your room?" I'm like, "Yes, this is my room, man." More staring. Then he slowly starts backing out while cursing me for leaving my window unlocked and not expecting him to break in. Motel on What Have, Sacramento. On May 31, 2014, 2 12-year-old girls lured their friend into the woods and brutally stabbed her in an attempt to summon or appease Slender Man, a fictional internet villain who is said to inhabit wooded areas and stalk his victims among the trees. I've posted this before, but when I was a baby, my dad played on a softball team. Typical social team, out for beers and pizza after with the guys, family event type thing. My parents were good friends with 2 of the other couples, both of them had young kids as well. On this occasion, the other 2 couples had left their kids at one of their houses, with a babysitter they were splitting. They invited my parents back to the house to have some more beers that night, but I was being fussy and my mom nixed the idea. Though they would 100% have normally gone back to hang out. Well, it turned out my fussiness on that day saved our lives. When the other parents got back to the house, they walked in on a home invasion. 2 men had broken in, tied up the kids and the babysitter, and her boyfriend, and were waiting for the parents, took the parents hostage as well, and made the dads drive with them to banks/a grocery store where one dad was manager and clear out accounts/a safe. They then came back to the house, and slaughtered both families, the babysitter, and her boyfriend. Kids included. They caught the 2 guys later on. My dad attended the trials, and said it was the first time he had ever had thoughts of supporting the death penalty. It still gives me chills to know how close we came to getting killed that day, too. Edit, wow, you guys are amazing detectives. I have been telling this story for years, and this is the first time I have been made aware that it wasn't me as a baby, it was my sister, 9 years older, born in '72. My dad has been telling me this story wrong for as long as I can remember. Sorry for the confusion, all. A pub in Kenbrook, Berkshire in UK has a pretty terrifying history. The Ostrich has seen its fair share of murders, and they say that over 60 were committed here. Most famous of all were those committed in the 17th century by the landlord of the time, Jarman, who with his wife made a very profitable sideline by murdering their guests after they had retired for the night. They had a trapdoor built into the floor of one of their bedrooms, and when a suitably rich candidate arrived, Jarman would inform his wife that a fat pig was available if she wanted one. She would reply by asking her husband to put him in the sty for till the morrow. The bedstead was hinged, and they would tip the sleeping victim into a vat of boiling liquid immediately below, thus killing him. The case of Elizabeth Smart. She was kidnapped, repeatedly raped, psychologically tortured, and then brought around in plain sight in heavy religious garb. She had brushes with people who could have helped her, but her kidnapper claimed she wasn't allowed to speak in public or reveal her face for religious reasons. The reason she was rescued is because her sister was awake during her kidnapping and pretended to be asleep. She knew she recognized the voice, but it took her 9 months to remember, as was a guy that used to do yard work for the family. The police didn't believe her because of the elapsed time, but pursued it to appease the family. One night about 2 years ago, I believe it was spring, and it was about 9 or 10 at night. A bit of context: my mother is a photographer and she has one of those big expensive cameras. Now I was just sitting in my room playing Xbox with my buddies, and I heard the commotion of my family in the doorway to the backyard, the kind of commotion of people gawking, so I went out to see what it was all about. I go to my dad and ask what it is, and he says there's something in our backyard, and my mom is out there trying to get pictures but her flash isn't working. And she's right at the fence trying to get pictures, and all of a sudden the flash goes off and lights up the pitch black yard, and right in front of my mom is a bear stood up on its back legs just standing there. By the time the flash was done, my mom was nearly in the house. The Battle of Osawich Fortress, 1915. German troops attempted to gas the Russian defenders out, as the fort had been a thorn in the side of the Germans since the outbreak of war. The gas succeeded in killing almost 3 whole companies. The Germans then advanced across the fields, expecting the fortress to be empty and an easy victory. From within the fortress, Russian troops emerged, coughing up blood and lung fragments, covered in bandages made up as improvised gas masks as well as chemical burns. They returned rifle and light artillery fire at the advancing Germans. The German troops didn't bother firing back, as they just ran back to their lines. Their commanders claimed they're already dead. Give it 20 minutes and go take the place, to which the soldiers remarked it is not men protecting that place. But the Devil Osawich Fortress never fell during the war, as when the German troops went back months after, there was already fresh defenders. I know this story is much different to the ones other people have said, but it's the one I could think of as truly terrifying. It happened to my mom's friend a couple of years back. She was driving on the highway in the middle of nowhere, as in far away from any town. Suddenly a car that is passing on her left steers fully to the right in front of her, causing her to brake and steer very rashly. This obviously causes her to lose control and crash against a tree. She passed out, and sometime later, she couldn't really tell how much time passed. A group of Brazilians, all of this happened in Portugal, came to her rescue and told her things like, "Don't move, we're calling an ambulance, just hang on there," etc. She eventually passes out again, and about 2 hours later someone else comes and starts helping her again, and eventually the ambulance and her husband arrive. She tells them that some other people have been there before, but the guy that found her says no one was there. When they checked the trunk, everything had been stolen, including computer, camera, etc. She later said that she remembers thinking the car that made her crash had been following her for a while and driving a little too close. Make of that what you want. Last week I would have said the Japanese war crimes or the rape of Nanking, but frankly, for me it's the fact that absolutely nothing is going to come of the Jeffrey Epstein arrest and connections, that some of the most influential people on earth are totally and visibly able to manipulate the system to cover the fact that they're rapists, pedophiles, and murderers. I would call it creepy more than scary, but my mom's friend had a small house and lived alone. She noticed weird things: a batch of soup depleting faster than usual, missing eggs, damp towels in the hamper when she hadn't used any, extra dishes in the dishwasher, etc. This went on for months. She thought she was just being forgetful. One day she heard some thumping around in her attic and went to investigate. She found some makeshift living quarters. Small radio, hot plate, sleeping bag, pillow, food wrappers, etc. She called the cops, who came to keep an eye on the place. They ended up catching a homeless man climbing a tree, trying to sneak into her attic window. He had been doing this almost daily. He would wait for her to go to work, then go downstairs and help himself to food and amenities. The funny part about this story is they got to know each other throughout the ordeal, and the guy was actually very respectful, just down on his luck. She didn't press charges, instead, let him move in, helped him get a job, and he lived in the attic until he got back on his feet. Creepy SHD with a happy ending. Personally, when I was detained by the Nicaraguan military while filming a documentary abroad, I seriously thought we were done for, because they had our team separated and we mixed our stories up. My legs were sharking. The main officer guy was a full-fledged Bond villain too. He had a jet black mustache, sunglasses and a golden canine tooth. He spoke broken English, so when he told us he could go, it sounded sarcastic and that we were going to be mowed down in the ditches we left in our bus. It was an insane story. My long-term partner decided to end his life suddenly and unexpectedly a few years ago. He was the happiest person I knew, and even with 20/20 hindsight, videos, pouring through old messages etc., I wouldn't be able to identify any warning signs. My friend's boss bought an Audi A4 convertible, back when they were new and interesting. One of the talking points was the pop-up roll hoops that were hidden unless you rolled it. A few months after buying it, he got to test those roll hoops out, as he lost control and skidded down a steep bank about 10 meters, till to 35 feet deep. The roll hoops did their job, and he survived with just cuts and scratches from the bushes he'd plowed through. The car ended up the right way up and he got out, walked back up the bank to the side of the road, then got on the phone to the police to report the accident. While he was standing there, a driver from a car that had seen the accident came over to speak to him. Approaching from behind, the other driver asked if he was okay. My friend's boss turned around to reply and dropped dead. His neck had been fractured, but was in one piece right up until he turned his head, when it severed his spinal cord. My mom didn't tell me this story for the longest time, I think just so she wouldn't unnecessarily worry me when I was younger. But my parents split up when I was about 4 years old, and my mom and my sisters stayed in a small townhouse for a few years before moving in with my stepdad. Anyway, while we were at the townhouse for I think less than a year, my mom heard something in her room in the middle of the night, and when she woke up to go look, there was a man in her room. She audibly gasped and got out of bed either to fight or run to our room. She couldn't really decide cause she was pumped full of adrenaline. The guy ended up running out of our back door, and when the police came they found signs of forced entry. She never told any of us the full story cause we were still sound asleep the entire time, but she ended up explaining more of it the older we got. Edit, sorry for not explaining more. A lot of people have asked me to finish this story, so here goes. We never found out who it was. The police weren't able to either. Their best guess was that he broke in to rob the place. God forbid he wanted to do anything else, and was just as surprised to see my mom as she was to see him. They think that he thought the place was empty and it would be an easy mark, and bailed when he came face to face with the owner. Before my dad died, he once told me a story from when he was in Vietnam in the 1960s. He told me about a mission where he and one other American with 5 Sich strikers, South Vietnamese villagers turned fighters, were tasked to emplace seismic ground sensors along a trail network deep in the jungle. He said they were about 2 days into the mission when he and 2 of the strikers split off from the main group to go watch a nearby trail intersection. He said the jungle was pretty quiet that day, just the sounds of birds and bugs and an occasional monkey. He said they had been watching the trail intersection for about 3 or 4 hours and were deciding on whether to move further down the trail or to turn back and link up with the rest of the patrol. Before leaving the cover of the brush, my dad said he checked the trail ahead of them one last time and prepared his men to move. Now here is where the story gets interesting, and he told this part with absolute dead seriousness. He said just as he started to step out onto the trail, he sees a light-skinned black Union cavalry soldier in full battle gear laying alongside the trail just shy of the intersection. My dad said the Union soldier had 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle and a short curved club at his hip. As my dad was trying to process what he was seeing, The soldier looked directly at him and smiled. Then the soldier slowly placed a finger up to his lips as if to tell him to be silent and then motioned my dad back off the trail. My dad said he signaled for his men to remain hidden, and he recalled that as he slipped back into the jungle on one side of the trail, the Union soldier did the same on his side of the trail. Less than 10 seconds later he said the lead element of a group of NVA, North Vietnamese Army soldiers, walked right through the trail intersection some 30 feet away. My dad estimated that the group was comprised of some 70 to 80 soldiers equipped with automatic rifles, light machine guns and rocket-propelled grenade launchers. He has no doubt that his entire team would have been wiped out on the spot. He said as soon as the enemy soldiers had passed, he and his team beat feet out of there as fast and as quietly as they could and rejoined with the rest of the patrol. He reported the enemy soldiers his team had encountered, but decided not to say anything about the soldier he had seen. My dad kept this secret for many years, only telling me just before he passed and earlier only telling his grandmother on her deathbed in the 1970s. He said when he told his grandmother, she smiled and without opening her eyes told him, "You saw old Red Tom." Red Tom was my great-great-grandfather. He was a half-black, half-Creek free man who was a scout for the Union Army during the Civil War and later served with the U.S. Cavalry in the American West. He was known for carrying 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle and a Creek war club into battle. Old janitor from high school, friendly Ecuadorian man who went by Ping, worked at the school for 20+ years and nobody had a problem with him. I guess his wife was leaving him and in the process of moving out, he caught her in bed with her new man. Next day, in the middle of town, he opened fire on her, the man, and then killed himself before any cops had time to respond. A woman named Joyce Vincent died alone in her bedsit/apartment in London and wasn't found for 2 years. She was only discovered because bailiffs came to evict her from the property and instead found her decomposed body in half-skeleton form. The TV had been on, and the windows had been open, for 2 years. Despite the smell and the noise emanating from the apartment, no one had come sooner and found her. Because of the state her body was found in, they could only identify her through matching her teeth to a photograph of her smiling. Because there was basically no body left to study, no one knows how she passed. Her friends guess it was anything from murder to an asthma attack, but no one can ever know. It's not the most scary story in terms of its gruesomeness. Some tales in this thread have made me nauseous, but to think someone can die alone and not be found by their family or friends for so long, especially in such a densely populated city, terrifies me. My mom was driving, and a guy ran out in the road, so she stopped so she couldn't hit him. It was nighttime, so it was pretty dark out, and 3 other men emerged from the forest around, all trying to use the door handles of her car to get in. She locked them luckily, and gassed it to the nearest town. Remember to always lock your car after you start it, because if it wasn't unlocked, who knows what would have happened to her. Neshaber train disaster is something that reminds me how death can come at any moment. A train with 51 wagons of sulfur, fertilizer, petrol and cotton wool somehow broke loose and rolled down the track about 20 kilometers until it derailed in the town of Qayyum, Iran. There were no humans on board. Chemical leaks ensued and authorities tried to extinguish whatever fires broke out. At one point, the whole thing explodes. And it really explodes. The whole town of Qayyum is literally demolished. 3 nearby towns are badly damaged and it was heard 70 kilometers away. The wreckage continued to explode for several days after. Around 300 people died and more than that injured. An earthquake of 3.6 on Richter scale was produced. There's a guy casing the bar that I work at literally right now, and I can't do anything to stop him. He's been in asking what time/days we're open, and what days we have security. Caught him feeling the corners of our windows and doors too. Unfortunately, until he breaks in and robs us, the police won't do a thing. I moved into another town. I was surprised by people who looked as they knew me, even though I saw them for the very first time. And everyone around was so rude, despite of all other sources telling how friendly people there were. I was also greeted by "Oh no, you again?" In one place where I went for the first time, I was looking for a room for rent, and one of the owners told me that he won't rent it to me, because my co-tenants saw me following and stalking them. I was like, what the fuck? Am I doing things and forgetting? Is something wrong with my mental health? Then, I went abroad for 3 months. No such thing was happening there. Everything was normal. I thought, guess it's just a local culture, They do that to get rid of newcomers. Once I returned, I went to a fast food to leave my CV. The guy said you were here a month ago, and it hasn't changed. We aren't recruiting. Right, I was on another continent. I couldn't have just bought 2 airplane tickets, spent several days, and just forgetting about it. And my bank account wouldn't forget, anyway. That's when I started to understand what's going on. And then one day, I finally saw myself on the CCTV, trying to steal something. Right. Stealing, following people and stalking, and being disliked, makes sense. There was some thief who looked exactly like me, even had similar hairstyle, which was in fashion around. As of now, I already know of 2 guys who look identically like me. When my aunt was about 16, she was working at a grocery store and had a boss in his mid-20s. One day he called the house and was begging her to sneak out and hang out with him. She was considering it because it was her boss and she didn't want to say no. My mom, who is 2 years younger than her, always gets these incredibly spot-on gut feelings. She had won the night and begged my aunt not to go out with him. Thankfully she listened to my mom and told him no, which made him really angry. He ended up going out that night and meeting another girl. He took her out to some cliffs and raped her and pushed her off. Somehow she lived through this and was able to get him sent to prison. I feel so sorry for that girl and so thankful for my mom and her gut feelings. Always trust your gut. I spent my first 10 years in New Delhi. Back then, we would find dead women, burnt with acid or set on fire, and it used to be so normal. Like, oh look, another one of those dowry cases where her family didn't pay the husband enough money so they killed her. Many years later I revisited those memories and realized how insane it actually was. I'd totally forgotten about all that. My friend tripped and fell onto the tracks, landing his face onto the 3rd rail. We kinda stood there in absolute shock because we thought he was dead, but then he said, "Can I move? Will I be electrocuted?" We told him to move instantly and he did. We got him off the tracks, and no less than 2 minutes later a train went zipping by. I think the 3rd rail turned on seconds after his face came off of it. I know that's not scary to a lot of people, but to me it was because I would have lost a close friend back when I was about 12. I used to run the boilers in a building. Apparently at some point in the 80s, 3 people were murdered over involvement in a big VCR theft. VCRs meant for the school system had apparently been stolen out of this warehouse. It was an inside job. Something went wrong. The head custodian was found shot to death, and later the bodies of the other 2 were reported buried in Monticello, but word is, they had first been incinerated. In the boilers I was in charge of operating and maintaining. There were 3 operational boilers, and 1 that wasn't in service. No clue which one was supposedly used. But when you're firing them up, you're typically the only person in the building. Not a single day went by that I fired them up and didn't wonder which one was used. But that wasn't what gave me the real heebie-jeebies. You have to clean the interior of these boilers really well, otherwise the fire won't transfer heat to the water very efficiently, especially with number 6 oil. These boilers would build up a lot of soot. You have to suit up in a Tyvek suit, wear a mask, and climb right into the firebox. I found myself staring down the business end of that burner many times, wondering what that panic would feel like. I'm reasonably sure these people were dead before getting put in the boiler though. Once, I was actually in one boiler while another one was running. The valve that isolated my boiler from the main steam line wasn't holding, and by the time I realized how warm it was getting, it was enough to panic trying to lift myself up and belly crawl through the small opening. The metal was almost too hot to keep my hands on for long. Definitely creepy experience, considering the history of that boiler room. The 1904 Cincinnati Privy disaster. In 1904, 9 schoolgirls drowned in an outhouse after the floor collapsed. They literally drowned in human waste. Alright, so my preschool teacher, who also ended up somehow changing jobs and becoming my 11th grade English teacher, had a super interesting life. Her mother had some super famous book. Her father worked high up in the government. But enough about her family. First, let me describe her to you. She had dark hair and blue eyes. You'll see why this matters in a minute. She told this story every single year to the new students in her class. When she was younger, she was driving through Arizona on a 2-way road while her boyfriend at the time was following behind her on his motorcycle. For those who don't live in Arizona, certain stretches of it can be quite isolated and deserted. She said that they were on a long drive. It's been about 6 years since I was in her class, so details are fuzzy, But basically her and her boyfriend both knew the destination where they were heading by memory and eventually got separated by a few miles. A man who was behind her in a Volkswagen Beetle kept pulling up beside her into the other lane. No one was coming, and motioning at her to pull over. She somewhat ignored him the first few times, but he kept doing it and began getting more frantic each time. She said that she believed that he spotted something wrong with her car, so she saw a parking lot off the road for a deserted gas station and pulled over. Once pulled over, she said that she instantly got an eerie feeling. The man was suspicious and kept telling her that he saw something wrong with her headlight and insisted she get out of the car so he could show her what he meant. Her boyfriend, who was a few miles behind her, eventually caught up and spotted her car at the sketchy gas station. Right as she was out of the car, her boyfriend began to pull in. As he did that, this man got into his car and sped off like his life depended on it. They later were able to identify that the man was Ted Bundy. She said she cannot imagine what would have happened to her if her boyfriend had been even another 3 miles behind her on the road. That giant billionaires, politicians, and celebrity all hide and cover for pedos and sex traffickers, and that they killed Jeffrey Epstein to cover it up. Imagine living your entire life in a work camp, or, the only reason you're alive is for your organs. Both being state-sponsored makes it that much more horrific. In the late 1950s, the Soviet Union spearheaded a campaign to convince the World Health Organization that smallpox could be eradicated. Smallpox is a highly contagious disease that is specific to humans. Insofar as we know, no other species on Earth can get or carry smallpox. In 1977, the last case of smallpox was identified and snuffed out. The disease was eradicated. However, rather than destroy the final genetic samples of the disease, the Cold War superpowers decided to store it. Some went to the Soviet Union and some went to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. The Soviets began a weaponization program. This means that they tried to make a stronger, more contagious, more lethal strain of smallpox. They tried to cross it with other diseases like Ebola, creating entirely artificial chimera diseases. They grew smallpox in the lab by the ton and kept it loaded, ready to be fired on missiles into the United States. But it's not a missile that's frightening. A single glass ampule of the stuff, smashed against the wall of a subway station in New York or Chicago or Tokyo, could spark a global outbreak. Very, very few people alive today have been vaccinated for smallpox, and there are but a scant few doses of vaccine available. In the event of an outbreak, our ability to manufacture vaccine would be rapidly outpaced. If the wrong person got their hands on the Soviet smallpox bioweapon, billions could die. Nuclear weapons are bad enough, but they, at least, require a general war to break out in order to bring about an end to human civilization. A smallpox bioweapon doesn't require a war, just one security breach. Various torture murders are probably the most horrific things I've read about. Junko Furuta, who was a perfectly normal girl until she was kidnapped off the street by a gang for no reason, purely wrong place, wrong time, according to Japanese sources, and unimaginably raped and tortured to death over 44 days. Kiki Camarena, a DEA agent in Mexico who was kidnapped by the Guadalajara cartel and tortured to death over about 3 days. His story is the central focus of the show Narcos, Mexico, but from what I've read, his death was even more brutal than what they make it out to be. A detail consistent in both is that they brought in a doctor to revive him numerous times when he got too close to death, and keep him conscious so he couldn't pass out from the pain. Kellyanne Bates, who was groomed from a young age by a scumbag who eventually killed her slowly over the course of about a month in their apartment. Her injuries were so horrific the jury at the guy's trial had to get counseling. For example, her eyes were missing and there were stab wounds in the sockets. Sylvia Likens, whose parents left her in the care of a woman who both personally and with the help of her children and their friends degraded, tortured, and killed over several months. The Hello Kitty murder in China, where a man and his about 13-year-old girlfriend kidnapped a prostitute who had supposedly stolen from him, even though sources say she had paid him back with interest, tortured her to death, and then stuffed her corpse into a Hello Kitty toy. Baby Brianna, a newborn whose mother, father, and uncle tortured and raped her from the second they brought her home from the hospital until the second she died. Baby P, a British toddler whose mother let her boyfriend torture him to death. His back was broken in his last days of life. Honestly, there are just so many horrifically on par with each other, you could list them all day. 100% true as it happened to me. It's probably more spooky than scary. I'll let you be the judge. Many years ago, before there were cell phones, we had these things called pagers strapped to our hips. Someone would page you with their phone number and you would call them back when you got to a phone. As an on-call technician working in the audio-visual field, my pager would go off all the freaking time. Like most people who used pagers, our clients knew that if you followed up your number with the 911, that would indicate to the technician to stop what they were doing and call right away. Although I was always busy, I rarely if ever got 911s. One afternoon traveling from Orlando to St. Petersburg via Interstate 4, my pager goes off with a number I don't recognize, followed by the 911. I find the first exit, and pull into a little truck stop looking place outside of Plant City, to use the payphone. This takes maybe 3 minutes tops. I walk in, ask for some change and head to the wall where there are 4 payphones to choose from. I pop my quarter in and dial the number displayed on my trusty pager. It rings. And rings. And rings. And rings. I'm thinking to myself, WTF, who would page me with a 911 and not answer their phone? It's just about then that I notice another ringing sound in addition to the one in my ear. I pull the handset from my ear and 2 phones over on the wall another payphone is ringing, but with an incoming call. I hang up the handset and the ringing stops on the other phone. I walk a few paces over, pick up the handset and look at the phone number printed above the buttons. I look at the number on my pager, I look at the number on the phone, I look at the number on my pager again. I look at the phone again. Except for the 911, they're identical. I kinda lose my breath for a second and then I make my way over to the girl at the counter and ask if she saw anyone use the payphone. She said I was the only person in the store in the last hour. The whole episode probably took 15 minutes, but man, I was freaked out. The hair on the back of my neck was standing straight up and I just wanted out of there. I get about 10 miles down the highway and come upon a scene that looked like a bomb went off. 4-car pile-up involving a tractor-trailer hauling a load of steel that had come loose, state troopers and paramedics just arriving. I pulled over to the side and helped the best I could, but it was all pretty much over once it began. I have no idea why I got that page or from whom or what, but I'm convinced that if I hadn't, I would not be alive to write this today. Artemis Pyle, the drummer from Lynyrd Skynyrd, survived a plane crash and walked to a nearby house only to be shot by the homeowner. The homeowner saw a bloody long-haired man and winged him. Pyle survived that as well and made a full recovery. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.